The blood of Colonel Amara Ellison spread beneath her luxury sedan as Officer Cole Brennan stood over her. With his weapon still drawn, the dashboard camera captured his horrified whisper when he saw her military identification. "My God, she's a colonel." But the footage would reveal something far worse than he ever imagined. Before diving into this shocking story, tell me where you're watching from in the comments. Hit the like button and subscribe if you want to see more stories about how justice prevails against systemic racism. Are you ready to see how a routine traffic stop became a national reckoning? Colonel Amara Ellison gripped the steering wheel tightly as she drove her midnight blue Lexus along the winding back roads of rural Georgia. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the asphalt as she headed back to Atlanta after visiting her sister. At her age, Amara carried herself with the composure and confidence born of 26 years of distinguished military service. The previous stretch of days had been particularly exhausting, filled with consecutive meetings at the Pentagon discussing her upcoming promotion to brigadier general. Her mind wandered to the stack of congratulatory messages waiting on her phone, and to the small celebration her son Darius had planned for when she returned home. The fatigue from the high-pressure meetings and the long drive was beginning to settle in, but she had only a short distance left until she reached home. In the rear-view mirror, Amara noticed the flash of red and blue lights from a patrol car. She sighed, having lived through that situation dozens of times before as a black woman driving an expensive car. Being pulled over had become an unfortunate regularity in her life, despite her impeccable driving record. She signaled carefully and pulled onto the shoulder, following the protocol she had mentally rehearsed countless times. Hands visible on the steering wheel, engine off, interior light on. Yes, it was dark. Stay calm and respectful. Officer Cole Brennan watched as the Lexus came to a stop, a satisfied smirk on his face. At 34, Brennan had spent 9 years with the Meriwether County Sheriff's Department and had earned a reputation within the local black community for harassing minorities, especially those driving luxury cars. "This should be interesting," he murmured to his partner, Officer Rafael Soto, a 26-year-old rookie with barely 3 months out of the academy. "Probably some drug dealer or rapper. A car too good for this neighborhood." Soto shifted uncomfortably but said nothing, already accustomed to Brennan's prejudiced comments. Brennan had spotted Amara's car at a four-way intersection and decided to follow her despite not having witnessed any traffic violation. He ran the plates but found nothing suspicious, which only seemed to frustrate him further. "I'm going to check this out. You stay in the car unless I call you," he instructed Soto as he adjusted his body camera. He approached the driver's side window with his hand resting on the holster of his weapon, a more aggressive posture than necessary for a routine stop. Amara lowered the window and greeted the officer with a practiced smile. "Good afternoon, officer. May I know why I've been stopped?" Her voice was firm and professional, revealing her years of command experience. Brennan's expression hardened at her composure. "License and registration," he demanded, ignoring her question. Something about her confidence irritated him. "Of course," Amara replied, keeping her movements slow and deliberate. "My registration is in the glove compartment and my license is in my purse on the passenger seat. I'm going to reach for them now if that's all right." Brennan nodded brusquely, eyes narrowed as he examined the immaculate interior of the luxury sedan. Amara carefully retrieved the registration first, then reached for her purse. "Officer, you still haven't told me why I was stopped," she said calmly as she searched for her wallet. "I wasn't speeding and I obeyed every traffic law." Brennan's jaw tightened. "I don't have to explain myself to you. I saw you run that stop sign back there." It was a lie, and they both knew it. In the patrol car, Soto watched the interaction with growing unease. He had seen this pattern before with Brennan, but he had never spoken up. Amara handed over her driver's license and registration, maintaining eye contact with Brennan. "Officer, with all due respect, I did not run any stop sign. Your body camera is on because I would like to request the recordings." Brennan's face flushed with anger. This was not how these stops usually unfolded. Most people were intimidated enough to stay quiet. "Step out of the vehicle, ma'am," he ordered, his voice taking on a dangerous edge. "Excuse me?" Amara remained seated, confusion clear on her face. "On what grounds?" Brennan leaned closer to the window, his face inches from hers. "I smell marijuana coming from this vehicle. Get out now or you'll be charged with obstruction." Another lie. The car smelled only of new leather seats and the faint scent of Amara's perfume. Soto twisted in his seat, knowing he should intervene, but paralyzed by the unwritten code of never contradicting another officer in the field. Amara's military training kicked in as she assessed the rapidly deteriorating situation. She recognized the danger, but she also knew her rights. "Officer, there is absolutely no marijuana in this vehicle. I do not consent to a search. I want to speak with your supervisor." Brennan's hand moved toward the clasp of his holster. "Out of the car now." Amara understood she had no choice but to comply with the illegal order. "I am unbuckling my seatbelt and opening the door slowly." She narrated each of her movements, aware of how quickly situations like this could turn deadly. As she began to exit, she remembered her military identification in her wallet. "Officer, I must inform you that I am Colonel Amara Ellison of the United States Army. My military identification is in my wallet." She leaned toward the passenger seat to retrieve her purse where she had left the wallet. Brennan only saw a black woman reaching for something after he had ordered her out of the vehicle. "Gun!" he shouted, drawing his pistol with alarming speed. Soto jumped out of the patrol car, his own hand moving toward his weapon, but it was already too late. 3 shots rang out in rapid succession. Amara's body jerked as the bullets tore through her shoulder and abdomen. She collapsed half in and half out of the car as blood immediately soaked her light blue blouse and dripped onto the asphalt. "Shots fired! Shots fired!" Brennan shouted into the radio even though no one had fired at him. The suspect tried to reach for a weapon. Soto ran toward her, his face pale with shock. "Where's the gun?" "I don't see any gun." He dropped to his knees beside Amara, who struggled to stay conscious, breathing in short, painful gasps. "There's no gun," she managed to whisper. "My military ID." Brennan remained frozen with his weapon still pointed at the woman bleeding out. Soto pressed hard on Amara's wounds, desperately trying to stop the bleeding. "We need an ambulance right now," he yelled at Brennan, who seemed paralyzed. "And holster your weapon." Finally snapping out of his trance, Brennan holstered his pistol and requested medical assistance. He crouched down and took Amara's purse, pulling out her wallet. His face drained of all color when he saw the military identification card with her designation clearly visible. "Colonel Amara Ellison, United States Army." "My God, she's a colonel," he whispered as the reality of what he had done began to sink in. The dashboard camera of the patrol car captured his horrified expression, the smoking gun in its holster, and the distinguished military officer bleeding out on the Georgia asphalt. In the distance, sirens wailed as an ambulance raced toward the scene. Soto continued pressing on Amara's wounds, his uniform now soaked with her blood. "Stay with us, Colonel. Help is on the way. Just stay with us." Amara's eyes fluttered as shock began to claim her. Her last conscious thought before darkness enveloped her was of her son Darius waiting for her at home, not knowing that his mother might never return. The fluorescent lights of the regional hospital cast a relentless glow over the emergency trauma unit as surgeons worked frantically to save Colonel Amara Ellison's life. Blood-soaked gauze piled up on the operating room floor while the medical team extracted the bullets that had torn through her body. "Blood pressure is dropping to 70/40, an anguished nurse called out as the heart monitor began to sound a warning. "She's lost too much blood. We need more O-negative immediately." The lead surgeon, Dr. Lila Chen, worked with expert precision, her gloved hands moving rapidly to repair the damage caused by Brennan's bullets. The first had pierced the lung, the second had struck the liver. She was lucky the third had only grazed the shoulder. Any deeper, and she would have bled out before reaching the hospital. Outside in the waiting area, the hospital began to fill with military personnel from the nearby Fort Benning base. Uniformed men and women stood in solemn groups, creating an island of disciplined calm amid the usual chaos of the emergency department. Captain Julian Crow, Amara's aide for the past 3 years, paced near the information desk with his phone pressed to his ear. "Yes, sir. Colonel Ellison is in surgery right now. The doctors haven't given us a prognosis yet." He listened carefully to the voice on the other end. "Yes, General, I'll keep you informed as soon as we know more. I've already contacted her son." He hung up and ran a hand over his face, the weight of the situation pressing down on his shoulders. Crow had been the first to arrive after receiving the automatic alert that Amara's military identification had been scanned by law enforcement. What should have been a routine notification had become a nightmare when the follow-up call informed him of the shooting. The hospital doors swung open as Police Chief Harlan Voss strode in, flanked by two of his deputies. At 57, Voss carried the weathered face of a man who had spent decades navigating the murky waters of law enforcement in rural Georgia. His immediate concern was not the well-being of the shooting victim, but controlling the narrative before it slipped out of his hands. "I need to speak with the doctor in charge of Colonel Ellison's care," he demanded of the receptionist, who eyed his uniform with weary resignation. "The doctors are in surgery, sir. No one is available to speak with you." Before Voss could protest, Captain Crow stepped forward with a military presence that stood in sharp contrast to the police chief's nervous energy. "Chief Voss, I presume. I'm Captain Julian Crow, aide to Colonel Ellison. Perhaps I can help you." Voss's eyes narrowed at the sight of the military officer. "This is a police matter, Captain. One of my officers was involved in an unfortunate incident with your colonel. We need to understand what happened." Crow held his gaze without blinking. "With all due respect, Chief, what happened is that your officer shot an unarmed senior military officer during a routine traffic stop. The Pentagon has already been notified, and I can assure you this will not be treated as just another unfortunate incident." The confrontation between the two men was interrupted by the arrival of a young man who burst through the hospital doors, his face marked by panic. It was Darius Ellison, Amara's 22-year-old son, who had raced from Emory Law School after receiving Captain Crow's call. "Where is my mother? Is she alive?" His voice cracked with emotion. Crow immediately approached and placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "She's in surgery, Darius. The doctors are doing everything they can." Darius's eyes filled with tears as the reality of the situation settled over him. Then his gaze fell on Chief Voss, and the pain in his expression hardened into something more dangerous. "You're from the department that shot my mother." Voss had the decency to look uncomfortable. "Son, I understand you're upset, but we need to let the investigation run its course before jumping to conclusions." Darius took a step toward him, hands clenched into fists. "My mother is a colonel in the United States Army. She doesn't even have a parking ticket. What possible justification could your officer have for shooting her?" Before Voss could answer, a nurse approached the group. "Family of Vanessa, Amara Ellison?" Darius turned immediately. "I'm her son. How is she?" The nurse's expression was cautious. "She's out of surgery and being moved to intensive care. The doctor will speak with you shortly about her condition. She's stable for now, but still in critical condition." Relief flooded Darius, followed quickly by renewed anger. He turned back to Chief Voss. "I want to see the officer who shot my mother. I want to know why this happened." Voss shifted uncomfortably. "Officer Brennan has been placed on administrative leave while the investigation is conducted. That's standard procedure. That's all I can tell you at this time." Captain Crow intervened before Darius could respond. "Chief Voss, I'm sure you understand that this incident will be the subject of both civil and military investigations. I suggest you ensure that all evidence, including body camera and dashboard camera recordings, is preserved." Voss's jaw tightened. "Of course, we have nothing to hide." The tension in the waiting room was broken by the arrival of Dr. Chen, still in her surgical scrubs. "Darius Ellison? I'm Dr. Chen. Your mother is a fighter. We've managed to stabilize her, but she's not out of danger yet. The next stretch of time will be critical." While Darius spoke with the doctor, Crow noticed a commotion near the hospital entrance. News vehicles were beginning to arrive, their satellite antennas extending toward the sky like mechanical flowers seeking light. Voss noticed it too and cursed under his breath. "How did they find out so fast?" The answer came seconds later when a junior officer approached Voss with a grim face. "Sir, we have a problem. Someone uploaded part of Officer Brennan's dashboard camera footage to social media. It's going viral." Voss's face darkened. "What footage? How is that possible?" The young officer handed him a tablet, and Voss watched with growing horror as the final moments of the stop played out for the world to see. The images clearly showed Amara reaching for her purse and Brennan firing without adequate warning. Worse, they captured his whisper upon realizing her military rank. A press conference was hastily organized in front of the hospital. Chief Voss stood before a forest of microphones, and his prepared statement did little to calm the growing outrage. We are investigating an officer-involved shooting that occurred during a routine traffic stop. The officer in question has been placed on administrative leave with pay while we conduct a thorough review of the incident. The gathered journalists were not satisfied with that generic response. Chief Voss, is it true the victim is a high-ranking Army officer? One reporter shouted. Why was Colonel Ellison shot when she was clearly unarmed? Asked another. Is it true Officer Brennan has prior complaints against him? Voss struggled to maintain his composure. I cannot comment on an ongoing investigation. We asked for patience while we gather all the facts. As the press conference unraveled, Darius watched from a hospital window, his legal training already analyzing the angles. Beside him, Captain Crow received another call from Washington. Yes, General. The Pentagon's request for information has already been submitted to local authorities. He listened for a few seconds. No, sir, they have not been transparent. We may need to apply more pressure. In the intensive care room, machines beeped steadily as they monitored Amara's vital signs. Her face, usually full of life, looked pale against the white hospital sheets, tubes and wires connecting her injured body to the equipment keeping her alive. Darius sat beside her, holding her hand carefully so as not to disturb the intravenous lines. I don't know if you can hear me, Mom, but I promise you this. The people who did this to you will be held accountable. I will not rest until there is justice. Outside in the hallway, District Attorney Trent Caldwell spoke quietly with Chief Voss. This is a political nightmare, Harlan. The dashboard camera footage doesn't leave your officer looking good. Voss ran a hand through his thinning hair. Brennan is a good cop who made a split-second decision. You know how these things are. The media blows everything out of proportion. Caldwell's expression remained skeptical. A split-second decision to shoot an unarmed black woman who happens to be a decorated Army colonel. This isn't going to disappear with the usual statement and paid leave. While they spoke, Darius stepped out of his mother's room, his law student instincts immediately identifying the district attorney. He approached both men with steady steps. Mr. Caldwell, I'm Darius Ellison, son of Colonel Ellison. I want to know when charges will be filed against Officer Brennan. The district attorney looked uncomfortable. Mr. Ellison, I understand your concern, but these investigations take time. We need to review all the evidence before making decisions about possible charges. Darius's eyes narrowed. The evidence is a video of your officer shooting my unarmed mother. What more do you need? Before Caldwell could answer, Captain Crow appeared with news. Darius, your mother's condition has stabilized further. The doctors are cautiously optimistic. As the day progressed, more military personnel arrived at the hospital, forming an unofficial honor guard in the waiting room. Pentagon officials continued calling for updates, and national media began broadcasting the story across the country. The narrative was beginning to take shape, but it remained to be seen whether it would be a story of justice or another example of accountability denied. In his apartment, Officer Brennan sat alone watching the news coverage with growing fear. His police union representative had already called, assuring him they would provide legal support. But as he stared at his own face on the television screen, labeled the officer who shot an Army colonel, Brennan began to realize that no amount of union protection could shield him from what was coming. The institutional machinery of self-preservation shifted into high gear. Headquarters of the Meriwether County Sheriff's Department buzzed with urgent activity as Chief Harlan Voss orchestrated what many would later call a cover-up. Everyone on the same page, he barked at his command staff gathered in the windowless conference room. The official version is that Officer Brennan perceived a threat and responded according to department protocol. Deputy Chief Michaels, a 20-year veteran, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Chief, the dashboard camera footage is already public. People can see what happened. Voss slammed his palm on the table. What they see is a fragment without context. Brennan stated he believed Colonel Ellison was reaching for a weapon. That's all that matters. Outside the police headquarters, a growing crowd of protesters held signs demanding justice for Colonel Ellison and an end to police violence. The department's social media accounts were flooded with furious comments, and news vehicles maintained a constant presence across the street. Inside a wood-paneled office several blocks away, Officer Cole Brennan sat across from 3 attorneys provided by the police union. His usual confidence had vanished, replaced by a pale anxiety that made him look 10 years older than his 34. "Remember," instructed lead attorney Lena Harlow, "you believed your life was in danger. You observed the suspect make a sudden movement toward an unknown object. You had no way of knowing she was reaching for identification." Brennan nodded mechanically, rehearsing the narrative that might potentially save his career and his freedom. "I believed my life was in danger," he repeated, the words feeling foreign in his mouth. "But what about Soto? What if he doesn't back me up?" Harlow's expression hardened. "Officer Soto understands what's at stake here. He'll do what's best for the department." Meanwhile, in the department's Information Technology office, another kind of damage control was underway. "I need you to tell me that the dashboard camera recordings from Unit 473 cannot be fully recovered," Voss told the nervous technician. "The file corrupted during upload." The technician, a recent hire named Raj Patel, stared at his keyboard. "But sir, I've already made backups of the original files. They're intact." Voss leaned in, lowering his voice to a threatening whisper. "Those files are evidence in an ongoing investigation. Accessing them without authorization would be a serious protocol violation." The implication was clear. By the end of the day, the department issued a statement claiming the original dashboard camera recordings had unfortunately been corrupted, and that only partial recovery was possible. In room 307 of the regional hospital, Darius Ellison had transformed his mother's room into an improvised command center. Laptops, legal pads, and coffee cups covered every available surface as he worked alongside Major Elena Vargas, a military attorney sent by the Pentagon to protect Colonel Ellison's interests. "Officer Brennan has 7 prior complaints of excessive force," Darius said, scrolling through documents on his laptop. "All against black drivers, and all dismissed by Internal Affairs." Major Vargas, an imposing woman in her early 40s with a sharp gaze and an even sharper mind, nodded gravely. "And I found 3 more that never even became formal complaints. They were resolved at the department level." She made air quotes around the word. "How is that possible?" Darius asked, anger and disbelief battling in his voice. "How does someone with this record keep his badge?" Vargas's expression was grim. "The same way it always happens. Files closed, forms altered, witnesses intimidated, and a system designed to protect its own." Their investigation was interrupted by a soft knock at the door. A nurse named Keisha Johnson entered, closing it carefully behind her. "Mr. Ellison, I shouldn't be doing this," she said, glancing nervously toward the door before pulling a folder from under her uniform. "These are your mother's medical records. The entry wounds don't match Officer Brennan's statement about the distance he was at when he fired." Darius took the folder with trembling hands. "Thank you. This could be crucial." When Keisha left, Major Vargas began examining the medical documents. "Brennan claimed he fired from about 4.5 meters when your mother made a threatening movement. But according to these wound patterns and the gunpowder residue, he was less than 1.5 meters away. He was right at the window." Darius clenched his jaw. He lied again. Across the city, Officer Rafael Soto sat in his modest apartment with a glass of whiskey in his hand and a moral dilemma weighing on his conscience. His phone had been ringing all day. Calls from the department, from Brennan, from the union representative. Everyone wanted to align his version of events, but the truth was painfully clear in Soto's mind. He had watched Brennan target Colonel Ellison without cause, escalate a routine stop into a confrontation, and then shoot an unarmed woman. The memory of her blood soaking his uniform haunted him in his dreams. When the phone rang again, Soto almost ignored it, but seeing an unknown number, he answered cautiously. "Officer Soto speaking." This is Major Elena Vargas of the United States Army Judge Advocate General's Corps. I'd like to talk about what you witnessed during Colonel Ellison's traffic stop. Soto felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. I can't discuss that. The investigation is ongoing. I understand your position, Vargas replied in a professional yet compassionate tone. But I also know you were the first to render aid to Colonel Ellison. You called the ambulance. You asked where the supposed weapon was. Those are not the actions of someone comfortable with what happened. After a long pause, Soto whispered, I never signed up for this. National attention intensified. Civil rights leaders arrived to join the protesters, and military veterans joined the crowds, many of them in uniform, despite regulations prohibiting political activity while wearing the military uniform. The Pentagon issued a formal statement expressing deep concern over the shooting of a decorated officer. Inside the hospital, a miracle occurred. Colonel Amara Ellison opened her eyes. Though dazed by pain medication and weakened by her injuries, she was conscious. Darius, who had been dozing in a chair beside her bed, woke at the sound of his mother's whispering voice. Tears filled his eyes as he carefully took her hand. Mom, you're awake. You're going to be all right. As Darius explained the situation, Amara's expression grew concerned. I remember being pulled over, but everything after that is blurred. That gap in her memory worried Darius and Major Vargas, who feared it could affect her value as a witness if the case went to trial. But for now, the simple fact that she was awake brought overwhelming relief. The afternoon press conference featured Chief Voss flanked by Mayor Grant Hollis, a politician with one eye always on the next election. We are conducting a thorough investigation, Voss assured the gathered journalists. Officer Brennan has an exemplary record in our department. That statement, broadcast live across the country, caused Darius to hurl his coffee cup against the wall of his mother's hospital room. Exemplary record? 7 complaints of excessive force are exemplary? The media landscape was also shifting. Early reports had described the incident as an officer-involved shooting during a traffic stop. Now the headlines read, Army Colonel shot by officer with history of racial complaints, and Pentagon demands answers over shooting of Black Colonel. The racial and military dimensions of the case had captured national attention, creating pressure local officials were unprepared to handle. Mayor Hollis, sensing the shifting political winds, began subtly distancing himself from the police department. While we support our officers, we also demand full transparency and accountability, he told reporters, ignoring Chief Voss's furious glare. What do you think about this situation? Will the police department's attempt to cover up the truth succeed, or will justice prevail for Colonel Ellison? Comment 1, if you believe Soto should tell the truth no matter the consequences, or 2, if you think the system is too powerful to confront. Don't forget to like this video if you want to see what happens next in this shocking true story. Will Officer Soto break ranks and tell the truth about what really happened during that traffic stop? Or will the thin blue line hold against the growing evidence? The stage was set for an explosive confrontation between a system accustomed to protecting its own and a family determined to find justice. The sterile conference room of the regional hospital had been transformed into an improvised war room. Darius Ellison and Major Elena Vargas leaned over a laptop, their faces illuminated by the blue glow of the screen as they analyzed the dashboard camera footage frame by frame. Look at this timestamp, Darius said, pointing to a corner of the video. Mom clearly has both hands on the steering wheel when Brennan approaches. There's no way she represented a threat. Major Vargas nodded, taking detailed notes. And here, when she reaches toward the passenger seat, she explicitly tells him she's going to get her identification. His body language changes immediately. He was looking for an excuse. The recordings had arrived through an anonymous email address from someone who identified only as Conscience. They suspected Officer Soto but could not be certain. Whoever the source was, they had provided the complete, uncorrupted dashboard camera video that the police department claimed was damaged. Even more incriminating was the footage from Brennan's own body camera, which captured the entire interaction from the officer's perspective. My God, Darius whispered as they watched the newly obtained body camera video. Before Brennan even approaches my mother's car, the audio catches his conversation with Soto. Let's see what we have here. Probably some drug dealer's girlfriend taking a spin in her car. The casual racism was evident even before first contact. As they continued watching, the evidence grew more and more damning. Brennan's aggressive posture, his refusal to explain the reason for the stop, his fabricated claim about marijuana. All of it contradicted the official police narrative. Most disturbing was the moment of the shooting from Brennan's body camera. It was absolutely clear that Amara had moved slowly, narrating her actions, and had given no reasonable cause for Brennan to perceive a threat. "We need to get this to someone who can break this story nationally," Darius said, his voice tight with contained anger. "Local media is too close to the police department. They'll bury it or soft pedal it." Major Vargas considered her options. "I have a contact, Alexandra Reyes at the National News Network. She's covered military justice issues before and won't be intimidated by local authorities." Within hours, they encrypted the video files and sent them to Reyes along with detailed timestamps and analysis. The response was almost immediate. Reyes wanted an interview with Darius, and if possible, with Colonel Ellison herself. The story exploded nationally. Alexandra Reyes's report was clinical in its precision, walking viewers through the unedited footage while highlighting the discrepancies between what actually happened and what the police department had claimed. The impact was seismic. Within hours, the hashtag Justice for Colonel Ellison trended nationally, and the video was viewed millions of times. Officer Brennan, who had been hiding at his sister's house in a neighboring county, watched the broadcast with growing horror. His phone would not stop ringing. Calls from the police union, from Chief Voss, from other officers. He ignored them all, knowing his career was effectively over. The question now was whether he would also lose his freedom. When his sister returned from work and saw the news, she quietly asked him to leave. "I can't have you here, Cole, not after seeing what you did." At police headquarters, Chief Voss called an emergency press conference, sweating under the harsh lights of the television cameras. He tried to control the damage. The recordings circulating have been selectively edited to show Officer Brennan in the worst possible light. "We stand by our officer and his statement that he perceived a threat." The gathered reporters were skeptical. Chief Voss, one journalist pointed out, "The footage clearly shows Colonel Ellison complying with all instructions and identifying herself as military personnel. How does that constitute a threat?" Another reporter pressed, "The uncorrupted material shows Officer Brennan making racially charged comments even before approaching the vehicle. Would you like to address that?" Voss's face flushed with anger. "No more questions at this time." As he retreated from the podium, the damage was already done. Back at the hospital, Colonel Ellison's room had become a center of activity. Her condition had improved enough for the doctors to move her from intensive care to a private room, though she still required significant care. Evidence of her distinguished military career was now on full display. Framed photographs of Amara on various deployments, medals and decorations brought from her home by Darius, and a steady stream of military visitors coming to pay their respects. Amara Ellison's service record spoke for itself. 26 years in the Army, multiple combat deployments, leadership of critical logistical operations during humanitarian crises in Somalia, Haiti, and the Philippines. She had saved countless lives by ensuring supplies reached disaster zones when conventional routes were compromised. Her innovations in military logistics had earned her the Distinguished Service Medal and placed her on track to become one of the few black women generals in Army history. This background information, now featured in reports across the country, transformed the narrative. Amara was not just another victim of police violence. She was an American hero who had nearly been killed by the very system she had sworn to protect. At the Pentagon, military officials who had initially expressed concern now openly demanded justice. General Theo Langston, Chief of Staff of the Army, issued a statement declaring, "An attack on Colonel Ellison is an attack on the United States Army and everything it stands for. We expect full accountability." The FBI announced the opening of a civil rights investigation, sending agents to interview witnesses and gather evidence independently of local authorities. Meanwhile, Officer Soto continued his internal struggle. The pressure from within the department was intense. Chief Voss had called him personally to talk about the importance of departmental unity. Deputy Chief Michaels reminded him of his probationary status and how easily his promising career could be derailed. But Soto could not erase from his mind the image of Colonel Ellison bleeding on the asphalt. Nor could he ignore the blatant lies being told to protect Brennan. When FBI agents contacted him, Soto made his decision. "I need to tell you what really happened," he said, "not what I've been told to say." At the regional hospital, Colonel Ellison began the painful process of physical therapy. Every movement sent shards of pain through her body, but her military discipline pushed her forward. "Take it easy, Colonel," the physical therapist insisted as Amara tried to sit up on her own. "Your body needs time to heal." "Time is a luxury we don't have," Amara replied through gritted teeth. "I need to be strong enough to testify." Darius watched his mother's determination with a mixture of pride and concern. He knew her willpower, but he worried about the toll the ordeal was taking on her, physically and emotionally. During one therapy session, he noticed her suddenly freeze, all color draining from her face. "Mom, what's wrong?" Amara's eyes had gone distant, unfocused. "I heard tires on gravel and then gunshots." She was reliving an intrusive memory, a symptom of the post-traumatic stress disorder the doctors had warned could develop. Darius helped her through the episode, but it underscored the invisible wounds, the ones that would take far longer to heal than her physical injuries. As the evidence against Brennan accumulated, so did the threats against those seeking justice. Darius began receiving anonymous messages warning him to back off and stop causing trouble. Major Vargas found her car tires slashed in the hospital parking lot. Even Alexandra Reyes reported receiving threats from police sympathizers furious over her coverage. None of them wavered in their pursuit of the truth. Public opinion had swung decisively against the Meriwether County Sheriff's Department. As more details emerged about Brennan's history and the department's attempts to cover up the truth, protesters gathered not only in Georgia, but in cities across the country. Military veterans formed protective lines around civilian demonstrators, a powerful visual symbol of solidarity that became national news. Chief Voss, once confident in his ability to control the narrative, found himself increasingly isolated. The mayor had stopped returning his calls. County commissioners were calling for an independent review of the department. Even some of his own officers began distancing themselves from the controversy. The wall of silence that had long protected problematic officers was beginning to crumble. For Colonel Amara Ellison, lying in her hospital bed and watching events unfold on television, the personal had become political in the deepest way. Her individual trauma had ignited a movement, illuminating systemic problems that had been festering in the dark for generations. "This is no longer just about me," she told Darius as they watched images of the protests. "This is about every person who has been profiled, harassed, or harmed because of the color of their skin." Darius gently squeezed his mother's hand. "And that's why we can't stop until there's real accountability, not just for Brennan, but for the entire system that protected him." The Meriwether County Sheriff's Department had transformed into a fortress under siege. Additional security barriers surrounded the building, and officers entered and exited through a rear entrance to avoid the persistent protesters who had established a round-the-clock presence at the main gates. Inside, Chief Harlan Voss had assembled a task force with a single mission: find something, anything, that can be used to discredit Colonel Ellison. Traffic violations, tax problems, neighbor complaints, problematic social media posts. There has to be something we can use to change the narrative. The officers exchanged uncomfortable glances. Lieutenant Sarah Johnson, a 20-year veteran, finally spoke. "Chief, with all due respect, we've run every possible background check. Colonel Ellison has an impeccable record. No criminal history, not even a parking ticket. Her financial records are clean. Her military service is exemplary. There's nothing to find." Voss's face flushed with anger. "Everyone has skeletons. Dig deeper." Across the city, in a glass-walled conference room of a high-powered law firm, Officer Cole Brennan sat beside his attorney Victor Lang, a silver-haired legal shark provided by the police union. "The prosecutor is pushing to file attempted murder charges," Lang explained in a clinical tone. "We need to get ahead of this narrative. Our defense will center on your perception of a threat." Brennan nodded mechanically. The preceding weeks had aged him visibly, with deep circles under his bloodshot eyes and a constant tremor in his hands. "And what about the videos?" Lang waved a hand dismissively. "Videos can be interpreted in many ways. We'll argue that you observed a threatening movement by Colonel Ellison, that your training kicked in, and that you acted to protect yourself and your partner." He leaned forward, expression hardening. "The key is to emphasize that decisions made in fractions of a second, in potentially deadly situations, cannot be judged with the luxury of hindsight." Outside the police department, the protests had grown in size and organization. What began as a local demonstration had become a national movement. Civil rights organizations, veterans groups, and police accountability advocates had joined forces, creating a coalition that demanded not only justice for Colonel Ellison, but systemic reform of policing practices. The police union mobilized its own counter-protest, with off-duty officers and their supporters gathering across the street holding signs that read, "Support the police" and "Back the Blue." The tension between the two groups was palpable, with uniformed officers forming a human barrier to prevent direct confrontation. Inside City Hall, Mayor Grant Hollis met with his advisors, all urging him to distance himself from Chief Voss. "The polls are clear," his campaign manager explained. 70% of voters believe Officer Brennan should be charged, and 65% think the department attempted a cover-up. You need to get on the right side of this or kiss re-election goodbye. Hollis rubbed his temples, feeling the political ground shifting beneath his feet. "What do you suggest?" "Call for an independent investigation of the entire department. Show that you're serious about police accountability." The mayor nodded slowly. "Draft a statement." Back at the hospital, Colonel Ellison had been moved to a private room in the military wing, thanks to the Pentagon's intervention. Her physical recovery was progressing, but the psychological impact of the shooting was beginning to manifest in nightmares and intrusive memories. During a physical therapy session, the sudden backfire of a car in the parking lot sent her diving to the floor in a defensive posture, her body remembering the trauma while her mind still processed it. "This is normal," the military psychologist assured her afterward. "Your body is processing the trauma. It will take time." Amara nodded, but the frustration was evident in her expression. "I don't have time. I need to be strong enough to testify." In another part of the hospital, Officer Soto met secretly with Major Vargas, his decision finally made after days of agony. "I can't be part of this anymore," he confessed, his voice barely above a whisper. "Brennan targeted her because she was black and driving an expensive car. He's done it before, many times. The department knows and does nothing." Vargas recorded his statement, asking precise questions that would strengthen his value as a witness. "What happened after the shooting?" Soto's expression darkened. "Chief Voss called me into his office. He told me my career depended on backing Brennan's version, that they could make me a detective next year if I remembered things the right way, or that they could make sure I never worked in law enforcement again." "And how did you respond?" "I said I needed time to think about it, but I can't live with this lie anymore." As Soto shared his knowledge of the department's internal practices, a disturbing pattern emerged. The targeting of minority drivers was not random. It was systematic. Officers like Brennan were assigned to patrol wealthier areas specifically to stop suspicious vehicles, code for minorities driving expensive cars. These stops generated pretext records that sometimes resulted in minor drug seizures, reinforcing the department's statistics and justifying budget increases. Meanwhile, Darius and Major Vargas had made another significant discovery. Working with a data analyst from the ACLU, they had obtained and analyzed 5 years of traffic stop data from Meriwether County. The results were devastating. Black drivers were 5 times more likely to be stopped than white drivers, 8 times more likely to have their vehicles searched, and 12 times more likely to have force used against them during the interaction. This isn't about one bad officer, Darius told the group of civil rights attorneys who had volunteered their services. This is about a systematic pattern of racial profiling that has been going on for years. The data analysis became the foundation of a class action lawsuit against the department, expanding the case beyond Colonel Ellison's individual experience to address the broader pattern of discriminatory policing. National media attention intensified as the Pentagon applied more pressure. Military officials requested that Colonel Ellison be transferred to Walter Reed National Military Medical Center, a move Chief Voss tried to block by claiming she was still needed for the local investigation. The jurisdictional battle that followed only highlighted the department's obstructionist tactics in the public eye. Opinion continued to shift as more details about Brennan's history emerged. A former Academy classmate came forward with screenshots of racist text messages. A dismissed former department employee revealed that complaints against Brennan had been systematically buried or downgraded. Most damaging of all, Soto's testimony about the department's targeting practices leaked to the press, triggering a new wave of outrage. In the courthouse, District Attorney Trent Caldwell found himself caught between opposing pressures. The police union demanded he refrain from filing charges, while public demonstrators demanded the maximum possible penalties. The FBI's involvement had added federal civil rights violations to the equation, potentially taking the decision out of his hands. When a grand jury was finally convened to consider charges against Brennan, the community held its collective breath. Chief Voss made one last desperate attempt to control the outcome, personally visiting the workplaces and churches of grand jury members in what many viewed as blatant intimidation. But the evidence was overwhelming and the public scrutiny too intense for the usual backroom maneuvers to succeed. For Colonel Ellison, watching these events from her hospital bed brought mixed emotions. The system was being forced to confront its failures, but at an enormous personal cost. Her career, her health, and her sense of safety had been shattered by 3 bullets fired in an instant of prejudice and panic. Was it worth it? She asked Darius in a rare moment of vulnerability. All this pain and struggle? Darius took his mother's hand, careful of the intravenous lines. You didn't choose this, Mom. But you've always taught me that when injustice occurs, we have a responsibility to fight it, not just for ourselves, but for everyone who might face it next. Amara nodded slowly. I just wish it hadn't taken nearly dying for people to pay attention. Outside her window, the sun was setting over a transformed community. Police vehicles patrolled in front of groups of protesters. Military personnel guarded the hospital entrance. Mobile news units filled the street. What had begun as a routine traffic stop had exposed the fractures of race, power, and accountability running through American society. And the battle was far from over. Grand jury proceedings began in the Meriwether County Courthouse, an imposing brick building that had witnessed more than a century of justice and injustice in rural Georgia. The morning air was heavy with humidity and tension as District Attorney Trent Caldwell entered through a side door, avoiding the crowd gathered on the courthouse steps. Inside the grand jury room, 23 county citizens prepared to hear the evidence that would determine whether Officer Cole Brennan would face criminal charges for shooting Colonel Amara Ellison. The proceedings were supposed to be secret, but in a case that had captured national attention, leaks were inevitable. Major Elena Vargas had obtained permission to observe the hearings as a representative of Colonel Ellison's military interests, an unusual concession that spoke to the Pentagon's influence. From her seat at the back of the room, Vargas watched with growing concern as Caldwell presented the case. The prosecutor is deliberately undermining his own case, she whispered to Darius during a recess. He's presenting the evidence in the most favorable light possible for Brennan, emphasizing split-second decisions and reasonable fear while minimizing contradictory evidence. Darius nodded grimly. He's going through the motions to satisfy the public demand for charges, but he doesn't really want an indictment. It's the classic prosecutor's trick when forced to bring a case against the police. The grand jury first heard from the medical examiner, who clinically detailed Colonel Ellison's injuries. Then came the forensic analysts who had examined the dashboard camera and body camera recordings. But the heart of the case would rest on the testimony of Officer Brennan himself and his partner. Brennan entered the grand jury room with a rehearsed confidence after being thoroughly prepared by the police union attorney on how to present himself. His testimony painted the picture of a routine traffic stop that turned threatening when the driver made sudden, aggressive movements toward an unidentified object. "I believed my life was in danger," Brennan testified in a steady voice. "Based on my training and experience, I made the split-second decision to use lethal force to protect myself and my partner." Members of the grand jury listened attentively, several nodding as he explained police use-of-force protocols. Caldwell's questioning was notably gentle, focusing on Brennan's training and the stressful nature of police work rather than addressing the specific contradictions in his account. Outside the courthouse, the drama continued to unfold. Darius had organized daily protests that grew with each passing day. Uniformed military veterans stood shoulder to shoulder with civil rights activists, creating powerful images for national media coverage. Colonel Ellison, still recovering but determined to be present, had given her first interview from her hospital bed the previous evening. The interview, conducted by Alexandra Reyes, presented Amara not as a victim but as a warrior facing yet another battle. "Throughout my military career I faced discrimination," she had explained, her voice steady despite the evident pain in her eyes. "I've been pulled over more times than I can count simply for being black and driving an expensive car or being in the wrong neighborhood. But I never imagined that asserting my rights would nearly cost me my life." Her dignified account of the persistent racial profiling she had endured during her distinguished career resonated deeply with viewers across the country. The interview concluded with her simple yet powerful statement: "I have spent my life defending American values abroad. Now I am fighting for those same values at home." Back in the grand jury room, the critical moment arrived with Officer Soto's testimony. He entered looking pale and nervous, his eyes scanning the room as if searching for an exit. Caldwell began with standard questions about his training and experience, clearly expecting the rehearsed answers that would support Brennan's version. But when asked to describe the traffic stop, Soto paused visibly, wrestling with his conscience. "Officer Soto, please describe what you observed during the traffic stop involving Colonel Ellison," Caldwell prompted in an encouraging tone. Soto took a deep breath. "What I observed," he began slowly, "was Officer Brennan targeting a black woman in an expensive car without any legitimate reason. What I observed was him turning a routine stop into a confrontation. What I observed was him shooting an unarmed woman who was clearly identifying herself as military personnel." The room fell silent. Caldwell's face flushed with anger. "Officer Soto, let me remind you that you are under oath." "Yes, sir. That's why I'm telling the truth." What followed was a devastating account not only of the shooting itself, but of the systematic cover-up that came afterward. Soto described how Brennan had made racially charged comments even before approaching Colonel Ellison's vehicle. He detailed the pressure he had faced to conform to the department's false narrative, including explicit offers of promotion in exchange for his cooperation. Most incriminating of all was when he revealed that Brennan's targeting of minority drivers was not an anomaly but a department policy encouraged by supervisors, including Chief Voss himself. There was a quota system, Soto testified. Not official, of course, but understood. Officers who made more arrests through these pretext stops were rewarded with overtime and promotions. The targets were almost always minorities, especially those who looked too prosperous for their race. When Soto finished his testimony, several members of the grand jury were visibly shaken. Caldwell tried to control the damage, suggesting Soto might be motivated by personal grudges or activist pressure, but the young officer's sincerity was convincing, especially in contrast to Brennan's rehearsed performance. As the proceedings continued, other witnesses further undermined Brennan's account. Military colleagues testified to Colonel Ellison's impeccable character and professionalism, and the independent use-of-force expert concluded that nothing in the video justified the use of lethal force. And perhaps most surprising, a former department employee revealed that Brennan had been sent to diversity training 3 times after complaints of racial bias, but that each incident had been kept out of his official file. Outside, as rain began to fall on the courthouse steps, Darius addressed the protesters and gathered media. "My mother has dedicated her life to serving this country with honor and distinction. She nearly died for the crime of being black in America. We are not only fighting for justice in her case, we are fighting to ensure that no one else faces what she lived through." The cheers of the crowd were deafening, drowning out the small group of police supporters across the street. After 5 days of testimony, the grand jury retired to deliberate. The standard for an indictment, probable cause to believe a crime was committed, was far lower than the beyond a reasonable doubt required for a trial conviction. Still, indictments against police officers were notoriously rare even with strong evidence. Inside the deliberation room, 23 citizens from diverse backgrounds wrestled with questions that went far beyond the specific case before them. They were not only deciding Brennan's fate, they were sending a message about accountability and equality before the law. The deliberations lasted just under 4 hours. When the foreperson emerged with the decision, the courtroom fell silent. In the matter of the state versus Brennan, the grand jury finds sufficient evidence to indict the defendant on the charges of second-degree attempted murder, aggravated assault, violation of oath of office, and civil rights violations. The announcement sent shockwaves through the community. At police headquarters, Chief Voss called an emergency press conference to announce his immediate retirement, citing health problems that everyone recognized as a transparent attempt to distance himself from the coming storm. Officer Brennan, waiting in his attorney's office, collapsed upon hearing the news as the reality of his situation finally settled in. For Colonel Ellison, watching the events from her hospital room, the indictment brought complex emotions. "These are only the first steps," she cautioned Darius, who had rushed to share the news. "The trial will be even harder." But there was no denying the significance of the moment. In a system that rarely held police accountable, the grand jury had heard the evidence and chosen justice over blind loyalty to law enforcement. What do you think will happen now? Will Brennan actually be convicted, or will the system protect him in the end? Comment 1 if you believe justice will finally prevail, or 2 if you think the police brotherhood will find a way to shield him from consequences. Don't forget to like this video if you want to see how this story concludes. Is this case a turning point for police accountability in America? Or just another brief moment of attention before everything returns to normal? Stay tuned to find out as Colonel Ellison's fight for justice continues. Colonel Amara Ellison stood by the window of her Atlanta home, watching as dawn painted the sky in shades of orange and gold. Her physical recovery had progressed enough for her to be discharged from the hospital, though daily physical therapy and the constant pain of her healing wounds remained relentless reminders of how close she had come to dying. The room behind her had been converted into an improvised office where Darius and Major Vargas worked tirelessly preparing for the trial. Files, legal documents, and multiple laptops covered every surface as they prepared for what promised to be one of the most closely watched criminal trials in recent history. "The arraignment is scheduled," Darius informed his mother as he entered with a cup of her favorite tea. "Brennan will formally enter his plea. The trial itself is set to begin soon." Amara accepted the tea with a slightly trembling hand, a lingering effect of her injuries. "How are you holding up?" she asked, noticing the dark circles under her son's eyes. Despite his youth, the preceding weeks had visibly aged Darius. He had taken a leave of absence from law school to focus completely on his mother's case, working side by side with Major Vargas and a team of civil rights attorneys who had volunteered their services. "I'm fine," he assured her with a tired smile. "This case is bigger than all of us now. It's about setting a precedent that could save lives." Indeed, the case had become a national flashpoint around police reform. Major media outlets maintained a constant presence in the small Georgia town, and hashtags related to Colonel Ellison remained among the top trends on social media. The Pentagon had issued multiple statements supporting its colonel, and military personnel continued to visit the Ellison home, forming an unofficial honor guard that symbolized the armed forces' solidarity. Following his formal indictment, Officer Cole Brennan had been arrested, booked, and released on a $500,000 bond guaranteed by the police union. His once confident demeanor had evaporated, replaced by a haunted expression that cameras captured as he was escorted in handcuffs from the courthouse to a waiting vehicle. The police union had assembled a formidable defense team headed by Victor Lang, a flamboyant attorney known for successfully defending officers accused of misconduct. Brennan acted according to his training, Lang declared to the assembled press after the arraignment. He perceived a threat and responded as any reasonable officer would under those circumstances. This indictment is politically motivated, a sacrifice of a good officer's career and freedom to appease an enraged mob. The defense strategy became clear immediately. Present Brennan as a dedicated officer who made a split-second decision in a potentially deadly situation. They found a controversial use-of-force expert, Dr. Harlan Weiss, willing to testify that Brennan's actions were consistent with police training and reasonable given the circumstances. "We have to be prepared for their experts," Major Vargas warned during a strategy session. "They'll throw every pseudo-scientific justification they can and hope something sticks with the jury." The prosecution team, led by Special Prosecutor Victoria Reyes, appointed after District Attorney Caldwell recused himself citing personal conflicts, was building its case around Brennan's history of racial bias and the clear evidence from the dashboard camera and body camera recordings. "We have the facts on our side," Reyes assured Colonel Ellison during a private meeting. "But trials are unpredictable, especially when they involve police officers. Juries tend to give them the benefit of the doubt." As part of the preparation, Darius had dug even deeper into Brennan's past, and his research yielded a disturbing result. "Mom, Major Vargas, you have to see this," he said one evening as the glow of his computer screen illuminated his expression. The others gathered around to look at a photograph showing a younger Cole Brennan at a white supremacist rally 5 years earlier. He was not in uniform, but he was clearly identifiable, standing beside men carrying Confederate flags and wearing shirts with racist slogans. "Where did you get this?" Vargas asked in a low voice. "From a social media archive. One of those groups deleted their public pages after Charlottesville, but the Internet Archive preserved them. Brennan was careful. He's not tagged and it's not his account, but it's definitely him." This evidence could prove devastating to Brennan's defense, which rested on presenting him as an officer without racial animus, who had made an honest mistake. Predictably, the defense team filed motions to suppress the photograph, arguing it was prejudicial and irrelevant to the specific incident. Judge Elias Thorne, a stern 65-year-old jurist assigned to the case, would decide on the admissibility of this and other contested evidence in the coming days. Meanwhile, the repercussions of the case continued to transform the Meriwether County Sheriff's Department. After Chief Voss's abrupt retirement, Deputy Chief Michaels was named interim chief and immediately announced mandatory implicit bias training for the entire department and a review of all use-of-force incidents from the previous 5 years. These reforms were widely viewed as too little, too late, but they represented a significant shift in a department that had previously resisted any acknowledgement of systemic problems. Officer Soto, whose grand jury testimony had been crucial in securing the indictment against Brennan, found himself in a precarious position. Although he was legally protected as a whistleblower, he faced ostracism from his colleagues, many of whom saw him as a traitor to the Brotherhood. "No one wants to patrol with me," he confided to Major Vargas during a trial preparation session. "My locker was vandalized. Someone slashed my tires. The message is clear. I broke the code of silence." Despite these intimidation tactics, Soto remained firm in his commitment to testify truthfully. His courage had inspired other officers to come forward with their own accounts of systematic racial profiling within the department, creating a domino effect that threatened to expose decades of misconduct. The defense team, recognizing the potentially explosive impact of the case, obtained a change of venue for the trial, arguing that the extensive media coverage and community protests had made a fair trial impossible in Meriwether County. Judge Thorne granted the motion, moving the proceedings to Baldwin County, a more conservative jurisdiction roughly 60 kilometers away. This tactical victory for the defense was tempered by the judge's ruling on the white supremacist rally photograph, which he found admissible as evidence of possible bias relevant to Brennan's state of mind during the traffic stop. As the trial date approached, Colonel Ellison faced her own difficult decision, whether or not to testify as the victim and key witness. Her testimony would be powerful, but the defense would subject her to aggressive cross-examination, using any inconsistencies in her memory of the traumatic event to undermine the prosecution's case. "You don't have to do this," Darius told her one evening as they discussed the pros and cons. "The recordings speak for themselves." Amara straightened in her chair, wincing slightly at the pain the movement caused. "I've faced enemy fire in combat zones. I can face Brennan and his lawyers in a courtroom. This is no longer just about me. It's about every person who has been profiled, every traffic stop that could have ended in tragedy. I need to tell my truth." The night before the trial began, a local news station aired footage of Brennan in a bar with 3 men identified as members of a local militia group known for its racist positions. The video, recorded only hours earlier, showed Brennan relaxed and laughing, a stark contrast to the image of remorse his defense team had carefully cultivated. The images went viral, adding yet another dimension to the complex narrative surrounding the case. The stage was set for a trial that would not only determine Brennan's fate, but could also redefine the national conversation about policing, race, and accountability. For Colonel Amara Ellison, the path to justice had been paved with pain, courage, and an unwavering commitment to the truth. As she prepared to face the man who had shot her across a courtroom, she found strength in knowing that her individual struggle had become part of a larger cause for systemic change. Colonel Amara Ellison sat fully upright on the witness stand in the Baldwin County courtroom, her military bearing evident despite the pain that still plagued her recovering body. Her eyes briefly met those of Officer Cole Brennan, seated at the defense table in a conservative navy blue suit that had replaced his usual uniform. He looked away immediately, unable to hold her steady gaze. The courtroom was filled to capacity, with journalists, legal observers, and members of the public competing for the few available seats. Outside, hundreds more gathered on the courthouse steps, holding signs demanding justice for Colonel Ellison and an end to police violence. The trial had become a national spectacle, with live coverage and minute-by-minute updates flooding social media. Judge Elias Thorne opened the proceedings with a stern warning against allowing the media character of the case to influence the judicial process. "This court will be governed by the rule of law, not by public opinion or external pressures," he instructed a carefully selected jury of 8 women and 4 men, a diverse group reflecting the county's demographics. Special Prosecutor Victoria Reyes opened with a powerful statement that laid out the state's case in direct terms. "This trial is about accountability," she told the jurors, her voice resonating in the silent room. "It is about an officer who saw the color of Colonel Ellison's skin before he saw her humanity. It is about a system that enabled and protected him until the evidence became too overwhelming to ignore." Methodically, she guided the jury through the sequence of events, using the unedited dashboard camera and body camera recordings to illustrate the unnecessary escalation of a routine traffic stop into a near-fatal shooting. The impact was undeniable as jurors watched Brennan approach Colonel Ellison's car with his hand already resting on his weapon, heard his aggressive tone when he refused to explain the reason for the stop, and witnessed the moment he fired 3 times at an unarmed woman who was clearly reaching for her identification exactly as she had been instructed. Defense attorney Victor Lang responded with an opening statement that emphasized the split-second nature of police decisions and the genuine fear officers experience when confronting potential threats. "Officer Brennan did exactly what his training taught him," Lang argued. "When he perceived a sudden movement toward an unidentified object, he responded to protect himself and his partner. This tragic outcome was not the result of malice or prejudice, but of the harsh reality of police work, in a country where officers must make life-or-death decisions in fractions of a second." 3 days into the trial, the prosecution's case had gained significant momentum. Forensic experts had testified that the angle and proximity of the shots contradicted Brennan's claim that he had fired from a distance in response to a threatening movement. Medical professionals had detailed the extensive injuries Colonel Ellison suffered and the grueling recovery process that still continued. Most damaging to the defense was the testimony of Officer Rafael Soto, who offered a first-hand account of Brennan's history of targeting minority drivers and the department's systematic efforts to cover up the shooting. Brennan specifically followed Colonel Ellison's car because, in his own words, "It was too good for someone like her to be driving in this neighborhood," Soto testified in a firm voice despite the palpable tension in the room. He had no probable cause for the stop. It was based solely on racial profiling, something I had seen him do numerous times before. Lang's cross-examination was aggressive, suggesting Soto was motivated by personal animosity toward Brennan or by activist pressure, but the young officer remained unshaken. His testimony was reinforced by documentation he had secretly kept about similar incidents during his short career. The prosecution also called several of Brennan's former colleagues, who reluctantly testified about his pattern of targeting minority drivers and making racially charged comments. One officer recounted that Brennan referred to predominantly black neighborhoods as hunting grounds for traffic stops that could lead to searches and arrests. Their testimony painted a portrait not of a single rogue officer, but of a departmental culture that encouraged and rewarded discriminatory policing. When Colonel Ellison prepared to testify, the courtroom fell silent. Despite weeks of preparation, the prospect of recounting the traumatic event under hostile questioning had left a visible mark on her. Still, she spoke with the clarity and precision that had marked her military career, describing the routine drive home that had turned into a nightmare. "I had been pulled over many times before simply for being black and driving an expensive car," she explained. "I knew the procedure. Keep your hands visible, move slowly, be respectful even when the officer is not. I have taught the same survival tactics to my son since he was old enough to drive." She recounted Brennan's aggressive approach, his refusal to explain the reason for the stop, and the growing hostility when she calmly asserted her rights. "When he ordered me out of the vehicle based on a clearly fabricated claim that he smelled marijuana, I knew the situation was dangerous. But I also knew that sudden movements could be misinterpreted, so I narrated everything I was doing." Her voice wavered slightly as she described the moment of the shooting. "I reached for my military identification, telling him clearly what I was doing. The next thing I remember is pain, extraordinary pain, and the sensation of my blood soaking my clothes. I remember thinking about my son, wondering if I would ever see him again." Long's cross-examination was methodical, attempting to identify inconsistencies in her recollection of the traumatic event. "Colonel Ellison, you claim you clearly stated you were reaching for your identification, but Officer Brennan testifies he did not hear any such statement. Is it possible that, given the stress of the situation, you believed you said something you did not actually verbalize?" Amara's response was measured but firm. "The body camera recordings confirm exactly what I have testified. I clearly stated I was reaching for my military identification. Officer Brennan chose not to hear or to ignore what I said." After 3 days of prosecution witnesses, the defense began presenting its case. Brennan himself took the stand with a carefully cultivated appearance of remorse and subdued demeanor. Under Lang's careful questioning, he described his 12 years of police service, including community awards he had received. "I became an officer to protect and serve," Brennan testified. "That has always been my goal." Addressing the shooting, Brennan claimed to have observed a sudden, threatening movement that, in the context of numerous officer deaths during traffic stops, triggered his defensive response. "I believed my life was in danger," he insisted. "I would have responded the same way regardless of the driver's race." However, Special Prosecutor Reyes's cross-examination systematically dismantled that narrative. She walked him step by step through his history of disproportionate stops of minority drivers, through the racial comments captured on his body camera, and through the photograph showing him at a white supremacist rally. "Officer Brennan, you have testified that race played no role in your decision to stop Colonel Ellison or in your subsequent actions. How do you reconcile that claim with your documented history of targeting minority drivers, And your association with white supremacist groups? Brennan's composure cracked under the questioning. That rally was years ago. I was just curious. It has nothing to do with how I do my job. And the comments you made before approaching Colonel Ellison's vehicle? Those in which you assumed the driver was some drug dealer based solely on seeing a black woman in an expensive car? Brennan had no effective answer. His credibility visibly crumbled with each unanswered question. The defense's use of force expert, Dr. Harlan Weiss, testified that Brennan's actions were consistent with police training for responding to perceived threats. But under cross-examination, he was forced to acknowledge that the video showed no objective threat justifying the use of lethal force. Most devastating was Reyes's simple question. Dr. Weiss, if Colonel Ellison had been a white woman in the same scenario, do you believe Officer Brennan would have perceived her movement as threatening and responded with lethal force? After a long pause, Weiss admitted, based on the statistical evidence of disproportionate use of force against minorities, probably not. As the trial entered its final phase, both sides presented closing arguments that encapsulated the broader implications of the case. Lang emphasized the dangers of police work and the split-second decisions officers must make, urging jurors not to judge those decisions with the benefit of hindsight. A conviction in this case would send a chilling message to every officer who risks his life to protect our communities, he warned. Reyes, in contrast, framed the case as an opportunity for accountability and change. Officer Brennan's actions were not a mistake or a momentary lapse in judgment, she argued. They were the foreseeable result of a pattern of bias that views black citizens as inherently suspicious and dangerous. Colonel Ellison nearly paid for that bias with her life. Today you have the power to say clearly that such bias has no place in policing and that those who abuse their authority will be held accountable. As the jury began its deliberations, Colonel Ellison, Darius, and their supporters gathered in a private room in the courthouse. The weight of the preceding weeks hung heavy in the air. The physical and emotional pain, the public scrutiny, the knowledge that her personal tragedy had become a symbol in the ongoing national conversation about race and policing. Whatever happens, Amara told her son, squeezing his hand tightly, we have already won in many ways. We have exposed the truth. We have shown that the system can be forced to confront its failures. Darius nodded, though the tension in his posture revealed his anxiety about the verdict. But without accountability, how much will really change? After just under 7 hours of deliberation, the jury reported that it had reached a verdict. The courtroom filled rapidly, with Brennan and his defense team on one side and Colonel Ellison's supporters on the other. Judge Thorne instructed everyone to remain civil regardless of the outcome. Has the jury reached a verdict? He asked the foreperson, a middle-aged black woman who had remained impassive throughout the trial. Yes, Your Honor. The clerk took the verdict form and handed it to the judge, who reviewed it briefly before returning it to the foreperson to read. In the matter of the State versus Brennan, on the charge of second-degree attempted murder, we the jury find the defendant guilty. A collective gasp swept through the room, followed by muffled sobs of relief from Ellison's supporters. Brennan collapsed into his seat as the color drained from his face. The foreperson continued reading the guilty verdicts on the remaining charges: aggravated assault, violation of oath of office, and civil rights violations. As the weight of the verdict settled, Brennan fainted and required medical attention. He was led from the courtroom in handcuffs, his career and his freedom now lost as a consequence of his actions. Outside the courthouse, the crowd erupted in celebration. The verdict represented not only justice for Colonel Ellison, but a rare moment of accountability in a system that too often protected officers from the consequences of their misconduct. For Amara Ellison, watching Brennan being taken away brought complex emotions. Justice had been done, yet nothing could erase the trauma of that day or completely heal the physical and psychological wounds she would carry forever. Still, when she stepped out of the courthouse to address the supporters and gathered media, her military bearing once again became evident. This battle has been won, but the war for true equality and justice continues. 2 months after the shooting that had forever changed her life, Brigadier General Amara Ellison stood before a packed auditorium at the Pentagon, the single star on each shoulder of her immaculate uniform gleaming under the lights. The promotion ceremony, originally scheduled to take place quietly before the shooting, had been transformed into a powerful symbol of resilience and justice. Secretary of Defense Caldwell pinned the star onto her uniform with solemnity. General Ellison's unwavering courage in the face of enemy fire abroad and injustice at home exemplifies the highest ideals of military service, he declared amid thunderous applause. Her leadership will guide us not only in military matters but also in the essential work of ensuring that the values we defend abroad are fully realized here at home. When she took the podium, Amara's gaze swept the audience. Her son Darius sat in the front row, his face radiant with pride. Beside him sat Major Elena Vargas, whose tireless legal work had been instrumental in achieving justice. Officer Rafael Soto, who had sacrificed his career to tell the truth, was also there, now employed as a consultant to the Pentagon for a new law enforcement reform initiative. Conspicuously absent was Cole Brennan, who awaited sentencing in a county jail cell. The jury's guilty verdict had sent shockwaves through police departments across the country. For decades, officers who shot unarmed civilians rarely faced charges, let alone convictions. Brennan's case had broken that pattern of impunity, establishing that a badge was not an absolute shield against accountability. "This promotion is an honor," Amara began, her voice steady despite the occasional flare of pain from her healing wounds. "But today I want to speak about a different kind of service, the duty we all have to build a more just society." Her speech addressed not only her personal experience but also the systemic problems it had exposed. "What happened to me was not an isolated incident or the action of a single bad apple. It was the foreseeable result of systems that tolerate bias, discourage accountability, and treat some citizens as inherently suspicious based solely on the color of their skin." Her words resonated throughout the auditorium and across the country as the ceremony was broadcast live on multiple networks. "My case received attention because of my rank and status, but countless people face similar injustices without cameras, without advocates, without public outcry. Their stories deserve the same commitment to truth and accountability." In the weeks following Brennan's conviction, the ripple effects continued transforming law enforcement across the country. The Department of Justice initiated a pattern or practice investigation of the entire Meriwether County Sheriff's Department, uncovering decades of systematic civil rights violations. The findings led to a consent decree requiring a complete restructuring of the department under federal oversight. Former Chief Voss now faced his own legal troubles. Following Soto's testimony about the department's cover-up attempts, prosecutors filed obstruction of justice charges against Voss and 3 senior commanders. The thin blue wall that had protected problematic officers for generations was beginning to fray under unprecedented scrutiny. Officer Soto, initially marginalized as a traitor to the Brotherhood, was vindicated by the investigation's findings. The interim chief promoted him to sergeant in the newly created Community Accountability Division, charged with investigating citizen complaints and use-of-force incidents. Although some officers still avoided him, others began recognizing his moral courage and following his example. Several came forward with their own accounts of misconduct they had witnessed and previously kept silent about. The most significant change, however, was legislative. Representative James Lawson introduced in Congress the Colonel Ellison Police Accountability Act, a comprehensive reform bill that would establish national standards for use of force, mandate body cameras, create a national database of police misconduct, and eliminate qualified immunity protections for officers who violate clearly established rights. The bill gained bipartisan support, with several conservative lawmakers joining after meeting personally with General Ellison. Darius Ellison graduated from Emory Law School a semester ahead of schedule. His experiences had accelerated his studies and focused his professional ambitions. He accepted a position in the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice, determined to address systemic problems from within the legal system. In addition, he and his mother established the Ellison Justice Foundation, dedicated to providing legal representation to victims of police misconduct, who lacked the resources or platform to fight for themselves. My mother and I were fortunate, Darius explained during a television interview. We had military support, media attention, and the resources needed to pursue justice. Most victims do not have those advantages. Our foundation seeks to level that playing field. Brennan's sentencing hearing drew national attention. The former officer, now gaunt and hollow-eyed after his time in custody, offered a tearful apology that many viewed as motivated more by self-preservation than genuine remorse. Judge Thorne sentenced him to 15 years in prison, making clear that the penalty reflected not only the shooting itself, but the pattern of biased policing and the subsequent attempts to cover it up. This sentence sends a message that a badge is not a license to discriminate or to use lethal force without justification, the judge declared. It affirms that those entrusted with protecting the public must in turn be accountable to the law. Perhaps the most surprising development occurred 3 months after the sentencing. General Ellison, now fully recovered physically, though still dealing with occasional symptoms of post-traumatic stress, requested permission to visit Brennan in prison. The private meeting, held without attorneys present, lasted nearly an hour. What passed between victim and perpetrator remained largely confidential, but both emerged visibly affected. I needed to see him not as a monster or a symbol, but as a human being whose decisions and prejudices nearly killed me, Ellison later explained to a close friend. And I needed him to see me the same way, not as a target or a threat, but as a person whose life and dreams matter. That humanizing perspective influenced Ellison's new role leading the Pentagon's task force on military-civilian law enforcement reform. The initiative sought to apply the integration strategies and accountability structures that had proven effective in the military to civilian policing, creating new training protocols and oversight mechanisms that could be implemented nationally. The military is not perfect, Ellison acknowledged during a panel discussion, but we have made significant progress in creating a culture where diversity is valued and every service member is respected regardless of background. Those lessons can also transform civilian policing. As the first anniversary of the shooting approached, the transformation continued. The Meriwether County Sheriff's Department, under new leadership and federal oversight, had implemented comprehensive reforms including community oversight boards, implicit bias training, and stricter use of force protocols. Traffic stop data showed a dramatic reduction in racial disparities, and citizen complaints had fallen by 60%. Similar reforms were being adopted in departments across the country, either voluntarily or under pressure from local governments responding to constituent demands. For General Amara Ellison, the journey had been painful but purposeful. What began as a routine drive home had become a national reckoning with deeply rooted problems of race, power, and accountability. Her personal tragedy had catalyzed systemic change that would protect countless people from similar injustices. Sometimes transformation requires trauma, she reflected during the dedication of the new headquarters of the Ellison Justice Foundation. My hope is that the pain I endured will lead to a future in which no one faces discrimination or danger simply because of who they are or how they look. As she concluded her remarks, the audience rose in a prolonged standing ovation. Among them were not only civil rights activists and military colleagues, but also police officers, legislators from both parties, and ordinary citizens inspired by her courage and commitment to constructive change. The work continues, Ellison reminded them when the applause finally faded. Justice is not a destination we arrive at once and for all. It is a path we must walk every day with vigilance and hope. The case that began with gunshots during a traffic stop ended with a nation transformed, not completely or perfectly, but significantly. The system that had protected Cole Brennan and countless officers like him was forced to confront its failures and begin the difficult work of reform. And the woman who had nearly died on a Georgia highway now led the march toward a more just and equitable future for all Americans. What do you think of this story of injustice and ultimate accountability? Has it changed your perspective on police reform and racial justice in the United States? Leave your comment with your thoughts. If you believe stories like this should be shared to raise awareness and drive change, please like, subscribe, and share this video with others who need to hear it. Thank you for joining me on this powerful journey through Colonel Ellison's fight for justice. And remember, each of us has a role to play in building a more just society. What other stories of courage and transformation would you like to hear next? This powerful story teaches us that systemic change often requires personal sacrifice. Colonel Ellison's ordeal highlights how deeply racial bias can be embedded in institutions meant to protect all citizens equally. It demonstrates that accountability is possible, but only through persistent effort and collective action. Her case underscores the importance of evidence in exposing the truth, as body cameras and dashboard cameras were crucial in revealing what truly occurred. Officer Soto's courage reminds us that individuals within flawed systems can make ethical choices that catalyze reform. The military's support of Ellison illustrates how institutions can remain true to their values when put to the test. Perhaps most importantly, this story reveals that justice is not solely about punishing the guilty. It is about transforming systems to prevent future harm. Ellison's decision to channel her trauma into creating lasting change rather than seeking vengeance offers a powerful model for turning personal pain into social progress. The bipartisan support for reform legislation demonstrates that protecting human dignity can transcend political divisions when we confront uncomfortable truths with honesty. Does this story of Colonel Ellison's struggle against racist policing practices impact you? What changes do you believe are most urgent in law enforcement to prevent similar incidents? Share your thoughts and experiences. If you consider these conversations about racial justice and accountability necessary, please like this video and subscribe to support more content that addresses these difficult topics. Share this story with those who need to understand the reality many Americans face every day. Thank you for witnessing Colonel Ellison's journey from victim to catalyst for change. Together we can build the more just society for which she is fighting.